Hello.
Testing, testing. Testing, testing.
We hear you. We hear you.
Great. Just testing my own mic there.
Okay. If you can center yourself in your camera, it would be better.
Yeah, I'm going to.
Okay. There you go.
That's good.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Lovely to be with you. My name's Ethan Tucker. I'm not Eli Confer. I don't play him on TV, but I am here to join in as part of this exploration of the Haggadah. Apologies for my somewhat primitive microphone here, but excited to be learning with you in these trying times. So what I wanted to do this morning is look at the verse that I think is the most famous or sort of most overused verse. Let's say it's the most overused verse in the Haggadah, even though perhaps it's not the most famous. We could take a poll. I could do a Zoom poll even, but I won't, of what you think is the most famous verse in the Haggadah. But I want to make a case for a verse I'm going to put up here on the screen, which is one that appears over and over and over. I'm going to have a source sheet here that's going to mostly have things in the original because I want to do a close reading of the biblical text and play out the midrashic background and use of this verse. But I'm also going to chat into the window. The Safari link for the chapter will mostly be on, and you can follow that as is helpful. Let me just chat that over. There we go. So either follow in your own Tanakh, or you can pull that up alternately with what I'm sharing my screen with. But we are going to look at some things from that. In particular, this verse, Exodus 13:8. Okay. Vehigadta levincha bayom hahu lemor ba'avur ze asa Adonai li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. Almost every part of this verse is puzzling and or caught the rabbinic eye. If you are familiar with the Haggadah from past years, you will see that this verse, or at least parts of it, get quoted in all kinds of contexts. Perhaps the most striking use of it is in the context of the four sons, the four children, and we'll be talking about that aspect primarily this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And that is its double use in the context of the four sons. So the source sheet is just online. I didn't send one out. We're just going to be following on the screen here, but I'll also be narrating it all. So the four sons have the four children, however we want to render it, has a chacham, a rasha, a tam, and a she'eno yodea lish'ol. And they correspond, the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask, to four passages in the Torah where a child is referenced. And the child is referenced in dialogue with the parent. We will get the broader context on that in a minute. And there are different answers given. However, in the Haggadah, this verse, "Ve'igadta levincha bayom hahu lemor, ba'avur ze asa Adonai li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim," is actually used both as the answer for the wicked child and for the child who doesn't know how to ask. We'll come back to how that plays out in a few moments, but that's our first sense that this verse is going to be heavily used. Okay, it's going to be heavily used as part of our exploration. But it shows up in other places. There's another midrash about the timing of the Seder, which we'll come back to. Can it be done in the day? Does it need to be done at night? And then it's used perhaps in the most dramatic context of Bechol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim, this unusual imperative that each person is supposed to see themselves as if they personally came out of Egypt, is also anchored in this verse. So I want to basically, in our session this morning, do a kind of exploration of what caught the midrashic eye here, and end up sharing with you a range of midrashim, a range of close readings of the text that I think give us an incredible window into how one verse can teach us a tremendous number of things, and what I think happen to be some very important lessons, some of them particularly this year as we observe Pesach. So let's just go over the broader context here. And I chatted you over the Safari link for chapter 13. You can also back up if you want briefly to chapter 12 right before it, which gives a little of this context, chapter 12, verse 21. This is just the background where Moses is telling the people to get ready for Pesach, that first Pesach, by putting blood on their doorposts. and by doing so, God will pass over the house, and that they should keep this for all time. And then I'll re-chat this. Someone else is asking for those who have joined in. All right, you can go ahead on that link if you wish. So you want to go to verse 25, okay? Exodus 12:25. And you'll see here what I have here on the screen. When you come to the land that God will give to you, as God spoke, you will observe this worship rite. When your children say to you, what is this worship rite to you? ואמרתם זבח פסח הוא לאדוני אשר פסח על בתי בני ישראל במצרים, בנוגפו את מצרים ואת בתינו הציל. You will say, this is the Pesach sacrifice offering to God who passed over the houses of the children of Israel, the Israelites in Egypt, when the Egyptians were smitten, but our homes were saved. Okay, there's nothing so striking about that on its own. It's a dialogue between a child who wants to know what's going on and an explanation of what's happening. You may already, if you're remembering aspects of the Haggadah, note that this phrase, what is this worship to you, becomes the basis of the back and forth with the wicked child. To you and not to me. We'll return to that drasha in a minute. Note that here, this question, later deemed to be problematic or even offensive in the Haggadah, is given a totally standard answer in the Torah. Yeah, here's why we do it, and our houses were saved. All right, so that is sort of question one. Now, moving forward to chapter 13. So you can go back forward again to there. Here we get a scene where Moses tells the people, starting in chapter 3, remember, keep in mind this day when you came out of Mitzrayim from the house of bondage, God took you out of here with a strong arm, and chametz shall not be eaten. You are coming out today in the month of Aviv. We'll return to that phrase later. But when you're brought to the land with all the nations, which God has promised to give to you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall worship this worship service in this month. Very similar to the previous formulation. Eat matzot for 7 days. On the seventh day, it's a holiday to God. Matzot shall be eaten for 7 days. Do not allow chametz to be seen in your possession anywhere where you live. Vehigadeta levincha, here's our verse, and you shall tell your child on that day, saying, it is on account of this that God did this for me. Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li, when I came out of Mitzrayim. B'tzeiti mi-Mitzrayim. Now, this is something I want to focus on in much greater detail, but you already see the person who's reading the Torah, and let me sort of emphasize this, the reader of the Torah in a rabbinic midrashic mode reads the Torah like a love letter. If you want to understand midrash, you have to have read a love letter at least once in your life, which is to say the mode of searching over something letter by letter, comma by comma, feeling that there must be some meaning in every decision of the author to do something slightly different. For the Hamilton fans among you, this is captured by my dearest Angelica, with a comma after dearest, right? That line where there's a notion of, was there a comma there? Was there not a comma there? Did that change the entire meeting? That is how the midrash works, okay? And so anyone reading these passages back to back will note, well, that's interesting. Back up here, everything was in the plural. Ma avodah zot lachem va'amartem batenu. Everything is put out in the plural form. And here suddenly, a scant chapter later, we have switched into the singular, all right? Asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mi-Mitzrayim. And even though the whole thing is in the singular here, v'haya ki yeviacha b'chol gvulecha lo yira'elecha, so it fits locally. It doesn't sort of stick out as a sore thumb here in the local point. When I think about the broader context, and I see the parent here saying, "Vet batenu hitzil," our homes were saved. But here I hear about when I went out of Egypt. That's already one thing that's striking. Okay, The other thing that's striking here, and we'll see this reinforced in a minute, is this verb, v'higadeta. Of course, the origin of where we get the notion of the Haggadah as an action in general. If you paid attention back up here, the verse in 12:27 is va'amartem, you shall say, perhaps a verse with a slightly different valence. So these are already things that the darshan, the midrashically sensitive ear, the person reading the Torah as a love letter would note. Now, when you go on to the other two accounts, which is right later in chapter 13, and then in Deuteronomy chapter 6, you see that this distinctive quality of chapter 13, the first child in chapter 13, is reinforced. So here too, chapter 13, verse 14, V'haya ki yishalcha v'incha machar lemor mazot ve'amarta elav. And in verse 15, Vayhi ki hiksha Pharaoh lishalchenu. So in verse 15, it's that plural again. When Pharaoh sent us out, not me out, but sent us out. Hotzianu, back in 14. God took us out of Mitzrayim. And the two other features that are kind of reinforced here, the verb here is ve'amarta again, and not vehigadeta. And another thing we will now point out, there is again a question. That is to say, something we might have thought was a detail just worth passing over in chapter 12, which was ve'ayaki yomru alechem benechem. When your children say something to you, that is to say, it is deliberately dialogic, as opposed to in chapter 13, verse 8, vehigadta, you just kind of get up and proclaim something. Well, it turns out we now see that this proclamation mode is also an outlier, because here too in chapter 13, it is begun as a dialogue by a question from the child. Ve'aya ki yishalcha. And in Deuteronomy also, ki yishalcha ve'amarta hayinu, avadim hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Vayotzienu, God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. And the plurals just continue. Ve'otanu, Deuteronomy 6:23, God took us out of there. Lema'an haviotanu, to bring us, latet lanu, to give us, et ha'aretz asher nishpa la'avotenu, to our ancestors. Vayitzavenu, letovlanu, lachayotenu. Utzdakati elanu, ki nishmor elokeinu, kasher tzivanu. I'm not making this up. I'm not making a big deal out of this here. This is something, if you pay attention to the verses you see, there is actually an obsession with putting this in the first person plural in every other passage where a parent is addressing the child. Only 13:8 in Exodus stands out as being in the singular with this verb vehigadeta, without any dialogue that begins. And as the traditional commentators say, ze omer darsheni. This begs out for a midrash, for some kind of explication. All right, that's the context that I want to spend the next 15 minutes unpacking with you by looking at a number of different midrashim. And here you can refer back to the verses if you wish, but I suggest you follow on the screen so I can point out the different issues here that they are bringing up. All right, some of them go to just some peculiar features and language of the verse, and some of them are going to zero in on this singular plural dimension and the different things that it might mean. So the first thing that the Midrash learns from this unusual verse is actually something about timing. So here we have passages from the Mechilta, the collections of early Midrashim from the time of the Mishnah on the book of Exodus, on the book of Shmot, collections from the house of Rabbi Ishmael, that's the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, and the house of Rabbi Akiva, that's the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And here in the first passage, the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, we get a comment on this verse. Vehigadta levincha bayom hahu lemor ba'avur ze asa Adonai li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. Now I translated that free form as, you shall tell your child on that day, it is on account of this that God did this for me and took me out of Egypt. That's a little clunky if you pay attention to it. The Gadta levincha bayom hahu probably idiomatically, that just means in the future, on that day in the future. When your child asks you this in the future, when your child on the, 20th of Sivan, just wondering, hey, what's going on with this thing that we do once a year, even if you're not doing it right then, why are we Jewish? Why do we have these rituals? Is told that. But here, because it's Bayom Ahu, and earlier in the passage, just to remind us, it says, Hayom atem yotzim. Moses is saying, today you are going out in the month of Aviv. The Midrash can't resist seeing the words Bayom Ahu on that day as the date on the calendar that corresponds to the Exodus. And that triggers this Midrash. Shomea ani me Rosh Chodesh. Could it be that you can fulfill the obligation to tell the story of the Exodus to your children on Rosh Chodesh? That is to say, you told me, B'chodesh ha'aviv, in the month of Aviv. You didn't give me a date. And truth be told, Bible scholars will tell you when B'chodesh ha'aviv appears as a phrase, it actually generally means B'rosh Chodesh Aviv. It means the first of Nisan. It's a date. Talmud Lomar, the Torah comes to clarify, no, Bayom Ahu, on the same date when Moses was speaking to them to go out. So the story has to be told on the 14th. But wait a minute, if Bayom Ahu, could it be mi ba'od yom? Could it be while it's still daytime on the 14th? Talmud Lomar, ba'avur zeh. The phrase ba'avur zeh teaches you it must be at a time when matzah and maror are sitting in front of you on your shulchan. And since the mitzvah of eating matzah can only be fulfilled balayla hazeh, ve'achlu et habasar balayla hazeh, at night, as the Torah tells us in chapter 12 of Exodus, so it must be that the story can't be told until the night following the 14th, which of course is the 15th. Now, this phrase ba'avur zeh and how it proves that it's at a time when you have matzah and maror in front of you, I'll come to in a second. But there's a companion midrash which says, "Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li, kol zman shegufo shel Pesach kayam," that this requirement to tell the Exodus is only in force, can only be fulfilled as long as the body of the Pesach offering is still present, is still being eaten. This seems to be an end point. This seems to be an articulation of the idea that since the Pesach offering can only be done until midnight, then you have a deadline of midnight to finish telling the story. Don't tell that to people who like to go on too long in their seders. Also, it's astronomical midnight, so in a lot of places it's later. But the idea is you actually have a time window at the time when you are doing the ritual eating, which is starting at nightfall and ending at midnight, because of the phrase ba'avur zeh. Now, how does the phrase ba'avur zeh, which just seems to be on account of this, that we have a deadline? And here, a brilliant interpretation I heard from my colleague Amit Gvaryahu several years back, links this to verses in the book of Joshua, where this unusual phrase ba'avur zeh can be linked up to the word avur, which avur on its own can just mean on account of. But if you look at these verses, Joshua chapter 5, verses 10 through 12, Bnei Israel, the Israelites, encamped in Gilgal, and they performed the Pesach on the 14th day of the month in the afternoon towards the evening in the plains of Yericho. And they ate, vayochlu me avur haaretz, mi machorat haPesach, matzot v'kalui, be'etzem hayom hazeh. They ate literally from the produce of the land. They have just crossed in from the other side, and they had been eating the man, which had been falling from heaven, but they ate from now the produce of the land, referred to by the word avur, on the following day. And what was that? Matzot. They got some grain, they ground it up, they baked it into matzot. The darshan here is almost certainly using the unusual phrase ba'avur zeh to imagine a parent pointing to the matzah and saying, hey, it was with this produce, with this bread that we came out of Egypt. Without that visual prop, you cannot properly tell the story. Therefore, you've got to tell it at the time when the prop is out. Okay, that's the first use of our verse to establish time. Let's get into some of the more familiar ones and other ones related to it that I think are fascinating. So now we're going to dig down into the singular. Va'avur zeh asa Hashem li. God did this for me. This generates the famous statement in Mishnah Psachim, where it says, Bechol dor vador, chayav adam lirot et atzmo, ki'ilu hu yatsa mitzrayim. There's an obligation in every generation for every person to see themselves as if they came out personally. What's the proof? Li b'tzeitim mitzrayim. To me. This unusual formulation, which I want to emphasize here, is not only unusual because this person didn't go out of Egypt, right? This is a parent at a future time who didn't themselves go out of Egypt, but is unusual lexically back in the verse because it is the only of the 4 verses that has the parent speaking in first person singular. All of the other verses have speaking in first person plural. Says the Mishnah, this must be an indication that we are meant to hammer home the individualized nature of this story, okay? But there's another version of this that I think is pretty amazing. That appears in the other Mechilta, the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we saw briefly before. Asa Hashem li, which God did for me. This darshan imagines what is being emphasized here. Yachol ad shenitztarfa zechut kulan, ilo kein lo hayu kedai badavar. Could it be someone might look back on the story of the Exodus and think, maybe the only reason they were taken out of Egypt is their collective merit, their collective worth added up to something significant. And had that not been the case, no individual would have been worthy of being taken out of Egypt. Talmud Lomar, the Torah states, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li. It was on account of this that God did this for me. This teaches that every individual Jew, kol echad miYisrael, haya kedai sheyeyasu nisin al yadav. Every individual Jew was worthy of triggering a whole set of miracles to happen only on their behalf. This is an incredibly different thing. It's almost like the mirror image of using this verse as a rebuke, which we'll get to in a minute. It's saying each and every person basically has their own Exodus right, their own right to demand that the Exodus would have happened for them. So that too is being read from the li, not me in the sense of I'm an individual, I have to imagine myself. I am an individual, I have the worth to trigger the Exodus. Now, the most famous use of this is, of course, the one that we are familiar from the wicked child. This is the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael here. Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li, lama ne'emar. Why this unusual formulation of the individual, which is the only place where it occurs? Lefi shehu omer ma avodah zot lachem. Because the child said, what is this service to you? They threw it into second person on you. You therefore embrace it and speak back in first person. This is the ben rasha. This is the wicked child, shehotzi et atzmo min haklal, who took themselves out of the collective. And therefore, as a result of doing that, you too take him out of the collective. If that's the narrative that's going to be offered, well, you follow up on that narrative. Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li, God did this for me when coming out of Mitzrayim. Li velo lecha, me, for me, and not for you. And because you took yourself out of the collective, had you been there, you would not have been redeemed. Now, I think this is an interesting parallel. I'll just say something about this briefly. As a side point, I think people spend a lot of time on this passage at the Seder, and people, there's many Sedarim where people get very agitated about this, particularly imagining someone who's bothered to come to a Seder or is already sitting there, and you're going to push them out when they ask a tough question. And, you know, that's definitely an angle that has to be considered, and pedagogy is obviously extremely important. I think there is also a fundamental point here that is being made, which I don't think should be easily evaded, which I've described here as at the end of the day, we write our own narratives. And this Mechilta, perhaps in a way slightly different from the Haggadah text, but in a way that I think kind of has less of an edge to it, is less actually the parent necessarily rebuking the child. But what you've got here is, okay, I guess the way you're telling the story is that you're not a part of this story. So I will address you as such until you change your narrative. Of course, there are ways to bring people into narratives they don't yet realize they are a part of and to invite them in. But there are also consequences to the way we talk about things. The text, I think, is a reminder to each of us in ways. When do we talk about things in the first person? When do we talk about things in the second person? It could be in our work, it can be in our activism, it can be in all kinds of contexts. And actually other people's narratives about us get shaped in mirror image by the stories we tell about ourselves. This is another thing that's being drawn out of the Li. This happened to me. Now, how do they make this the answer to the wicked son? I just want to sort of go back to the text because it's very odd. You'll remember, "Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li," God did this for me, is the answer to nothing, it seems, right? Vehigadta levincha. This, as we'll see in a minute, is the answer to the child that doesn't know how to ask. How do they link it back to the question back up here in chapter 12? Ve'hayaki omru alechem b'nechem maha avodah hazot lachem. An answer which is given there is just God passed over our houses. How does the Midrash link this up? So here too, I think this is something that just occurred to me this year. It's my interpretation, but it seems totally right to me. This is a plural. B'nechem, your children. The others are always bincha, your child. That is to say, there ought to be two people who are asking this question. Ma avodah hazot lachem. And there are therefore two answers in the Midrashic mind. One is you have the houses that are passed over and we were saved, and that actually gets given later in the Haggadah. And the second answer to the second child is Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti miMitzrayim. I think that's just on a technical level how they link that verse up to that earlier segment and give it the harsh answer to the harsh initiative. Let me just end here with two final interpretations, which link onto not the li, but the word vehigadata. So the notion that vehigadata appears here instead of, it appears without a preamble. That is to say, in all the other cases, v'hayaki yomru alechem, when your children say to you, v'hayaki yishalcha vincha, when your child asks you. And here we just have an opening up, vehigadta levincha. Speak it to your child. The Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, "Af al pi shelo yishalcha, af al pi shelo sha'alcha," even though they didn't ask. And this is the midrashic base for the child that doesn't know how to ask. Vehiganta levincha at petachlo. You go ahead and open up. Sometimes the kid's not going to ask a question. But again, not just sort of from the fact that there's no question that immediately precedes this, but that there is a question in all the other cases, and therefore the silence here is striking. Now, the final one is very poignant, I think, this year. The Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai picks up on Vehigadta levincha, and Vehigadta instead of Ve'amarta. Higadta has some notion of declaring, as opposed to speaking to someone. That is to say, it is possible to do Haggadah without an addressee, in a way that to do Amirah is harder to do without an addressee. And therefore, the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, Ein li ela bizman sheyesh lo ben. If I follow the narrative of the Torah, it seems there's always a child. And therefore, maybe the obligation to do the Exodus retelling only applies to someone with a child. What about Beino Levein Atzmo? What if you're alone? What about Uveino Levein Acherim? What if you're with other people who aren't your kids? Minayin, how do we know? Talmud Lomar, Vehigadta levincha. If you wanted it to be a dialogue limited to a child, it should have said Ve'amarta levincha. Vehigadta levincha implies there is an obligation and meaning to telling this story, no matter who is there. The Rambam Maimonides poignantly captures this in a way that many people I know are going to have to deal with this year. Haya levado, if you're alone, sho'el le'atzmo, ma nishtana halayla hazeh. You ask yourself, how different is this night? Now, in a poignant way, if you're alone, you may be saying, wow, I can't believe I'm alone this year, as opposed to other years. But in a deeper way, the Rambam is saying Haggadah is something that is about declaring and forming our own narrative, independent actually of who is in the audience. So I hope you can take some of these messages, but also this sense that to me I find so powerful and I'm so passionate about, of the ways in which we can read the Torah really closely, and that these are really readings of words and phrases meant to generate meaning. Take them to the Seder. Take that close reading of the words. We will get out. We'll get out the sources on this if for those who want the full sheet. Rav Eli Comfer will be back tomorrow, and as the last line is befitting for here, we'll jump right into Manishtana and giving some broader focus on that. Hope everyone has a wonderful and fantastic Pesach, whether you're with others or by yourself, and hope it's a meaningful story. Have a wonderful day.